Ethan McGraw lived on the edge of the frontier, where the rolling plains met the rocky hills. His ranch stretched far, with cattle grazing under the wide sky. Life was hard, but he had grown used to the silence and the steady rhythm of work. He had been a widower for years, and the ranch was all he had left. He rose with the sun, mended fences, fed the animals, and worked until dusk. Yet no matter how busy he kept himself, the loneliness was always there, heavy like an unspoken weight. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold and crimson, Ethan saddled his horse and rode out to check the far fences. Coyotes had been prowling the night before, and he didn't want to lose more cattle. His rifle rested across the saddle, though he prayed he wouldn't have to use it. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying a faint smell of wood smoke. He paused, frowning. That smoke was too close. When he reached the southern pasture, he noticed something unusual. Near the wooden posts, slumped against the tall grass, was a figure. At first he thought it might be a drifter or a thief. He tightened his grip on the reins and urged the horse closer. As he approached, the figure stirred and tried to move. It was not a man, it was a woman. Her dark hair was tangled, her clothes torn, and her feet were bare and bleeding from long travel. She looked as if she had been walking for days without rest. Ethan stopped his horse and studied her carefully. Her features told him she was Apache. His jaw tightened. He knew the stories: raids, attacks, battles between settlers and tribes. A part of him wanted to turn away, to ride back to his house and leave her there, but another part of him could not. She was too weak even to stand. The woman lifted her head, her lips trembling. Her eyes held both fear and pleading, like a deer cornered in the wild. When she spoke, her voice was shaky, but the words were clear. "Please, rancher, don't hit," she cried, her hands trembling as she raised them slightly in surrender. "If you spare me, I'll give you a family." The words struck Ethan in a way he did not expect. He stared at her, unsure what she meant. Was it desperation? A bargain? Or just a wild hope from someone with nothing left? He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustle of the wind. Her voice broke again, softer now, full of exhaustion. "I have no one left. My people gone. I only want to live." Ethan dismounted slowly, keeping his eyes on her. His hand hovered near his rifle, though he didn't point it at her. Up close, he could see how thin she was, her cheeks hollow, her arms scratched from thorns. She looked more like a survivor than a threat. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice steady, though curiosity slipped through. "I walked," she whispered. "Far, I had nothing. No food, no fire, no family." Her eyes glistened with tears she tried to hide. Ethan hesitated. Bringing her back to the ranch could mean trouble. If the town found out, they would not forgive him for harboring an Apache woman. Old grudges ran deep, and fear was stronger than reason. But leaving her here was the same as leaving her to die. He was not that kind of man. "You'll freeze out here tonight," he said finally. Glancing at the sky where the first stars began to appear, she nodded faintly, though her strength was fading. She swayed, then slumped forward, barely catching herself with her hands. Instinct moved Ethan faster than thought. He stepped forward and caught her before she hit the ground. Her body was light, fragile, trembling with cold and weakness. "All right," he muttered half to himself. "Come on, then." He lifted her carefully onto his horse, making sure she was steady. She held onto the saddle horn weakly as he climbed up behind her. With a nudge, the horse began the slow ride back to the ranch. The journey was quiet. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of hooves and the faint breathing of the woman, who leaned against him as though the last of her strength had given out. When they reached the ranch, Ethan led the horse into the yard and dismounted. He carried her into the barn first, laying her gently on a bed of hay. The barn was warm from the animals, and it would give her shelter for the night. He brought her a blanket, a canteen of water, and some bread. She took the water with shaking hands and drank greedily, then nibbled the bread as though each bite mattered. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice so soft he barely heard it. Ethan watched her carefully. Her words earlier echoed in his head. "If you spare me, I'll give you a family." He didn't know what she meant exactly, but he saw truth in her eyes, truth in her fear, truth in her hope. She was not lying to save herself. She was clinging to the last piece of life she had. That night, Ethan sat on the porch looking at the stars. The land was silent, but his thoughts were not. He had always been a man who kept to himself, never asking for more than what the land provided. But now, in his barn, was someone who might change everything. She was not just an Apache woman seeking safety. She was a reminder that even in a harsh world, compassion still mattered. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. Tomorrow he would have to decide what to do. But tonight he had chosen to spare her. And maybe, just maybe, that choice would change not only her life but his as well. The next morning, Ethan rose before the sun as he always did. His body followed the old rhythm of work, boots on, hat pulled down, coffee steaming in his hand. Yet as he stepped out onto the porch, his eyes moved to the barn. He could not ignore the thought of the woman inside. She had looked half dead when he found her. He wondered if she had enough strength to even make it through the night. Pushing open the barn door, he found her awake, sitting quietly on the hay. She had pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and her dark eyes followed him the moment he entered. For a long moment, they just stared at one another. She did not look like an enemy. She looked like someone who had lost more than anyone should. "I brought food," Ethan said, setting down a plate with eggs, bread, and a bit of bacon. Her hands trembled as she reached for the plate. She whispered a faint word of thanks. Ethan noticed she tried to eat with care, as though each bite was sacred. He leaned against a post, studying her. "What's your name?" he asked. Her eyes lowered, then lifted again with quiet pride. "Ayoka," she said softly. He nodded. "I'm Ethan." For a while there was silence. Only the sound of horses shifting in their stalls and the soft clink of dishes as she ate. Finally she spoke again, her voice hesitant. "I did not mean to bring trouble," she said. "I walked far. My people scattered, many gone. I only wanted to find a place to breathe." Ethan crossed his arms. He understood more than he admitted. Life on the frontier was filled with loss, disease, raids, hunger, fire. Everyone carried grief, but hers seemed heavier. He thought about the words she had said when he first found her. "If you spare me, I'll give you a family." The memory still echoed like a strange promise he could not shake. "You can rest here for now," he said finally, "but you'll have to work if you stay." Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of strength. She nodded. "I know how to work." That day she helped him in small ways, fetching water, gathering eggs from the chicken coop, and feeding scraps to the pigs. Though her steps were slow, there was a determination in her movements. Ethan noticed how carefully she handled each task, as though proving her worth. He also noticed her eyes scanning the land, as if memorizing every tree, every hill, every turn of the earth. When the sun lowered again, Ethan caught her standing near the fence, looking out at the open fields. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between sorrow and wonder. "You miss your people," he said quietly. Ayoka turned to him, her voice steady but low. "I miss the sound of them. The fire at night. The songs. The children playing. I miss not being alone." Ethan felt something stir inside him. He too knew the emptiness of silence. His wife had passed years ago, leaving him with nothing but memories that grew fainter each season. Since then, the ranch had been nothing more than chores and long nights. Hearing her speak of family brought back the ache he had buried deep. Later that week, Ethan rode into town for supplies. As he walked down the main street with a sack of flour slung over his shoulder, he overheard the sharp voices of men gathered near the saloon. "McGraw's got a squaw hiding out on his land," one muttered. "Heard it too. Can't believe he'd take in one of them," another spat. "Nothing but trouble." Ethan stopped, his jaw tightening. He didn't bother correcting them or feeding their gossip. Instead, he walked on, but the words burned in his mind. He knew the town feared what it did not understand. They carried old wounds and deep mistrust. Bringing Ayoka into his ranch had already set tongues wagging. If the gossip grew, it could turn dangerous. When he returned home, he found Ayoka tending to the small garden near the barn. She had cleared weeds and straightened the rows of vegetables with surprising care. Ethan dismounted, his thoughts heavy. "You've been busy," he said. She glanced up, brushing dirt from her hands. "Work makes me forget." He studied her for a moment. Then he said, "The town knows you're here." Her body stilled, but her face remained calm. "Will they come?" "Maybe," Ethan admitted. "They're not kind to strangers, especially not to Apaches." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Ayoka lifted her chin. "You can send me away if you want no trouble." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. She was thin, tired, but there was fire in her eyes. Sending her away would be the easy choice. But he thought of the words she had spoken. "I only wanted to find a place to breathe." His conscience would not let him. "No," he said firmly. "You'll stay. Let them talk. This land is mine. My decisions are mine too." That night, Ethan sat by the fire in his home. For years, the house had been silent, the rooms cold. But now, knowing Ayoka was in the barn, there was a strange feeling he couldn't explain. It wasn't comfort exactly. It was more like a shift, as if the ranch was waking from a long sleep. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, Ayoka grew stronger. She began to rise before dawn, helping Ethan with chores. She carried water, chopped wood, and even learned to ride one of the calmer horses. Ethan found himself surprised by her resilience. She never complained, even when her hands blistered or her shoulders ached. At night, she would sometimes sit near the barn door and hum a low tune. Ethan, from his porch, would hear the soft melody carried by the wind. It was haunting yet gentle. He realized it was one of the songs she spoke of, songs of her people, now nearly gone. One evening, as they worked side by side repairing a fence, Ethan asked, "What did you mean that day, when you said you'd give me a family if I spared you?" Ayoka paused, resting her hand on the wooden post. Her gaze turned toward the horizon where the sky was painted with streaks of orange and violet. "I meant I have nothing left to give but myself," she said slowly. "A family is not only blood, it is choosing to stand with someone, to share work, to share silence, to share life." Ethan's chest tightened. He had expected a simple answer, but her words carried weight. He thought of his late wife, of the years he had spent alone, of the silence that had filled every corner of his home. For the first time, he felt that silence beginning to break. That night, Ethan could not sleep easily. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of coyotes. He wondered what future he had stepped into by letting Ayoka stay. She was different. Yet in her difference, she reminded him of something essential, something he had nearly forgotten, that no man was meant to live alone forever. As the weeks passed, Ayoka's presence on the ranch became less like that of a stranger and more like that of a partner. She worked quietly but steadily, proving her worth in a place that had once been empty of warmth. Ethan noticed small changes every day. The barn smelled fresher because she swept it out. The chickens produced more eggs since she tended to them gently. Even the garden began to show promise with her careful touch. Ethan found himself surprised by how naturally she adapted to ranch life. She had grown up in a world far different from his, yet she seemed to understand animals, land, and weather with an instinct that matched his own. When a storm rolled over the hills, she was the first to gather the chickens to safety. When a calf wandered too far, she was the one who spotted it in the tall grass before Ethan did. But with her presence also came whispers of discontent beyond the ranch. Neighbors began to stop by, pretending to make casual conversation while their eyes searched for signs of the Apache woman. Ethan knew their thoughts even without their words. Some tried to speak plainly. "You're risking your good name, McGraw," one man warned. "People don't forget who she is. Folks won't take kindly to it." Ethan's reply was always steady. "She's on my land, under my roof. That's all anyone needs to know." Still, the warnings weighed on him. The small town nearby was built on fear and prejudice, and it didn't take much to stir unrest. Ethan wasn't blind to the danger, but each time he saw Ayoka bent over the garden rows, her face lit by sunlight, or heard her soft humming in the barn at dusk, he knew sending her away wasn't an option. Trust was something that did not come easily to Ethan. He had spent years keeping his heart guarded after losing his wife. But slowly, without forcing it, Ayoka broke through the walls he had built. She began to speak more openly. At first it was small, telling him how she learned to track animals or how her grandmother had taught her songs by the fire. Then one evening as they sat outside watching the stars, she shared more. "When I was a child," she said softly, "my father told me the stars were eyes of our ancestors watching us. I believed him. I thought if I spoke to them, my voice would reach the ones who had gone before." Ethan listened quietly. The night sky stretched wide, filled with endless glittering points of light. He realized he hadn't looked at the stars with wonder in years. He had seen them only as part of the land he worked beneath. Her words gave them life again. "Do you still believe that?" he asked. Her eyes lingered on the sky. "I don't know, maybe. But when I look at them, I feel less alone." Ethan understood. He too knew the heavy silence of being alone. Her words reached into that part of him he rarely allowed anyone to touch. Not long after, an incident tested the trust they had begun to build. Ethan returned one afternoon from repairing fences to find Ayoka surrounded by two men from town who had ridden up while he was gone. Their horses stood tight at the fence and the men were speaking sharply, their voices filled with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" one demanded, his hand resting near the handle of his gun. "You don't belong on this land." Ayoka stood tall, her shoulders squared, though Ethan could see the tension in her posture. She didn't back down, even when their words grew harsh. Ethan rode in fast, dismounting with firm steps. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but filled with authority. The men turned, their expressions tightening when they saw him. "McGraw, this isn't wise," one said. "People won't stand for it. You should send her away before it's too late." Ethan's jaw clenched. "This is my land. She stays because I say she stays. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." The men exchanged glances, muttered something under their breath, and finally mounted their horses. With a last warning glare, they rode off, leaving dust in their wake. Ethan turned to Ayoka. She hadn't moved, though he could see her chest rise and fall with the effort of keeping calm. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said quietly, "They hate me because of what I am." Ethan shook his head. "They hate what they don't understand. But you're here now. That's what matters." Something softened in her expression then. She nodded, and for the first time she allowed herself to smile. A small fleeting curve of her lips, but it reached her eyes. Ethan found himself caught by it, surprised by how much warmth that single smile stirred in him. As days turned into more weeks, their bond deepened. Ayoka began to share stories of her childhood, of fishing by the river, of learning to ride bareback, of listening to her mother's voice carry across the camp. Ethan, in return, spoke of his youth, of how he built the ranch with his own hands, of the day he first saw his late wife at a church gathering. In sharing, they both discovered something unexpected, a common ground of grief and resilience. One evening, Ethan found Ayoka sitting quietly near the garden, her hands resting on her lap. The sunset painted her face in soft hues of orange and gold. He sat beside her, the silence between them not heavy but gentle, like the stillness of the earth before nightfall. "You've done much for this place," he said. "Feels different now, feels alive again." Her eyes turned toward him. "It's not the land that changed. It's you." Ethan looked at her, taken aback by the truth in her words. She wasn't wrong. He felt it too. The loneliness that once haunted him didn't weigh as much anymore. There was someone to share the burden of days with, someone who filled the silence. Their trust continued to grow through shared work and quiet moments. Yet Ethan knew it was fragile. One careless spark from town could ignite trouble for both of them. Still, he also knew he wouldn't let her go. He had made his choice. Late one night, as the wind howled outside and coyotes cried in the distance, Ethan lay awake listening to the soft hum of Ayoka's song drifting from the barn. It carried through the air, reaching him like a thread connecting two souls across the darkness. In that moment, Ethan realized something he had not dared to admit before. She was no longer just a guest or a stranger on his ranch. She had become part of his life, part of the land, part of the silence he once feared. And though danger from the outside world still loomed, Ethan knew that what was growing between them was stronger than fear. It was trust, built slowly, carefully, like the steady rising of the sun after the darkest night. The calm rhythm of ranch life did not last long. Trouble always found its way on the frontier, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before something tested the fragile peace he and Ayoka had built together. That test came one evening, just as the sun was falling behind the hills and long shadows stretched across the land. Ethan was in the barn, finishing chores, while Ayoka carried buckets of water from the well. The sound of distant hoofbeats broke the silence. At first he thought it was one of the neighbors, but the steady thunder of many horses quickly told him otherwise. He stepped out, eyes narrowing as a group of riders appeared over the ridge, moving fast. Their silhouettes cut sharp against the fading light. "Stay close," Ethan called out to Ayoka, his tone firm. She set down the buckets and moved quickly to his side, sensing the danger. Within minutes, half a dozen men rode into the yard. Their faces were hard, their clothes rough and worn. These weren't neighbors. They were drifters, raiders looking for easy prey. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, pulled his horse to a stop and smirked. "Evenin', rancher," he drawled, Looks like you've got a fine spread here. Plenty of cattle, plenty of land. Shame if something were to happen to it." Ethan kept his hand near his rifle but did not raise it. "You've come far enough," he said coldly. "This is private land," the man chuckled. "Private? Out here nothing's private. We take what we need. And we're needin' a lot." His eyes flicked toward Ayoka and Ethan felt his muscles tense. "You'll find no welcome here," Ethan said, his voice sharp as steel. The leader's smile faded. He signaled his men, who began to spread out, circling the yard. Ethan knew he was outnumbered, but fear did not show on his face. He stood tall, his eyes steady, a man unwilling to bend. Ayoka, watching closely, felt her heart race. She had seen such men before, men who preyed on the weak, who lived by taking. She also knew Ethan would fight to protect what was his, even if it meant risking his life. She could not let him stand alone. As the raiders moved closer, Ethan raised his rifle. "I said you've come far enough," the leader sneered. "One man with a gun against 6? You won't last long." But before Ethan could answer, Ayoka stepped forward. Her voice rang out clear and strong. "You do not know this land," she said firmly. "But I do, and if you stay, it will not forgive you." The men laughed at her words, mocking her tone. But Ethan saw something shift. Ayoka wasn't speaking in fear. She was speaking with the certainty of someone who understood the ground beneath their feet. The standoff lasted only a moment before one of the raiders lunged forward, trying to grab the nearest calf. Ethan fired a warning shot into the air, the sharp crack splitting the dusk. The animals scattered in panic, but the sound made the men hesitate. "Go!" Ethan barked. "You've no business here." The leader's smirk twisted into a scowl. "You'll regret this, rancher. We'll be back." He pulled his reins sharply and the group turned, galloping off into the night, dust rising behind them. Ethan lowered his rifle but did not relax. He knew they would return. Raiders never left empty-handed without plotting to strike again. That night, he and Ayoka sat by the fire in the house. The flames flickered across their faces, casting long shadows on the walls. Ethan stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "Men like that don't forget." Ayoka nodded slowly. "Then we must be ready." Ethan looked at her, surprised by her steady tone. "You're not afraid?" "I have lived through worse," she answered. "Fear does not stop danger. Only strength does." For the next days they prepared. Ethan checked and mended every fence, locked the barn doors tighter, and cleaned his rifles. Ayoka, in turn, used her knowledge of the land. She showed Ethan how to set quiet alarms with hanging cans along the fence line so they would hear if anyone crossed at night. She pointed out high ground that gave clear views of the valley. She even taught him how to read the tracks of riders more carefully. Together, they built a defense not of walls, but of vigilance and trust. Ethan was struck by her courage. She never complained, never wavered. Instead, she stood beside him, ready to protect the ranch as fiercely as he would. Their chance came sooner than expected. On the third night, under the cover of darkness, the raiders returned. Ethan woke to the faint rattle of cans in the wind. He grabbed his rifle and motioned to Ayoka. They slipped out quietly, moving to the edge of the yard. The riders crept in, their whispers carrying through the still air. Ethan steadied his aim, but before he could fire, Ayoka touched his arm. She pointed toward the barn, where one of the raiders was sneaking around back. Without hesitation, she darted off, her footsteps silent. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched her move with speed and precision, using the shadows to her advantage. She startled the raider with a sharp cry, spooking his horse, which bolted and knocked him into the dirt. Ethan fired at another, his shot striking the ground close enough to send the man scrambling. Chaos erupted as the animals in the barn began kicking and neighing, stirred by the noise. The raiders, unprepared for resistance, faltered. One yelled for retreat, and within moments they were pulling back, cursing as they fled into the night. The sound of their horses faded into silence once more. When it was over, Ethan found Ayoka near the barn, her chest rising with heavy breaths, but her eyes shining with determination. He felt a surge of admiration he hadn't expected. "You were brave," he said, his voice low but full of respect. She shook her head. "Not brave, just unwilling to lose what little we have." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding her truth. Together, they led the animals back into calm and checked the ranch for damage. The fences held, the barn was safe, and the land remained theirs. By dawn, the first light spread over the hills. Ethan and Ayoka stood side by side, weary but unbroken. For Ethan, it was more than victory over raiders. It was proof of what they had become together. She was no longer just a woman he had spared out of pity. She was a partner, a fighter, someone who shared the weight of the land with him. Later that morning, some townsfolk rode by, having heard the gunshots in the night. They expected to find ruin, maybe worse. Instead, they saw Ethan and Ayoka standing firm, the ranch untouched. Whispers spread quickly, but this time there was something different in their tone. The people saw not just an Apache woman, but someone who had defended what many thought could not be defended. The ranch felt different after that night. Stronger, more alive. And though Ethan knew challenges would still come, he also knew something had changed between him and Ayoka. The words she had spoken when they first met, "If you spare me, I'll give you a family," were no longer just desperate words of survival. They were becoming truth, forged in the fire of trials they had faced together. Morning light poured gently over the valley, spreading across the ranch like a quiet blessing. The long night of danger was behind them, but Ethan knew the memory would linger for years. He and Ayoka had stood side by side against men who sought to take everything, and together they had prevailed. That single night had changed something deep inside him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the bond they had forged in fire and trust. The town's reaction came quickly. By the end of the week, word spread of what had happened at the McGraw Ranch. Some still muttered in low tones, warning that harboring an Apache woman was foolish, that Ethan was playing with fire. But others began to look at her differently. They whispered about her bravery, about how she had defended the land as fiercely as any settler. Even those who did not speak kindly could no longer deny what she had done. Ethan didn't care much for town gossip, but he noticed the change. Men who once turned their backs now nodded curtly at him. Women who had whispered cruel things in passing now spoke with less edge in their voices. It was not acceptance, not fully, but it was a step. And in the hard world of the frontier, even a small step mattered. Back at the ranch, life settled into a new rhythm. The days were filled with labor, fixing broken gates, tending to cattle, planting rows in the garden. Ethan and Ayoka worked side by side, often in silence, but it was a silence that carried peace rather than emptiness. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the colors fade from the sky. Ethan found himself looking forward to those moments more than anything else. One evening, as they sat together, Ayoka spoke quietly. "When I first came here, I thought I had nothing left. I thought I was only waiting to die. But you gave me a chance to live again." Ethan turned toward her, his eyes steady. "I didn't give you that. You took it with your own strength. You've changed this place, Ayoka. You've changed me." She looked down, her hands resting in her lap. "You spared me when you could have turned away. I will never forget that, and I meant what I said that day. If you let me stay, I will give you a family, not just in children, but in spirit. A family is people who do not leave, no matter the storm." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He had carried loneliness for so long that he had almost forgotten what it meant to belong to someone. Now, in her words, he felt the truth he had been denying. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't a stranger. She was home. The following weeks deepened their connection. Ayoka continued to bring life into the ranch. She taught Ethan how to read the wind to predict storms, how to use certain plants to heal cuts, how to listen for signs of danger in the calls of birds. In turn, Ethan taught her how to mend saddles, how to brand calves, and how to trade fairly with the townsfolk. Each lesson shared between them became another thread in the fabric of the life they were weaving together. The townspeople slowly began to soften too. When they saw Ayoka bring vegetables to the church fair, or when she helped deliver food to a family struck with illness, they found it harder to cling to old hatred. Children, curious and less bound by prejudice, sometimes followed her at the fairgrounds, asking her to tell them stories. Ayoka would kneel, her voice gentle as she shared tales of animals and stars. Their laughter carried through the air, and for the first time, Ethan thought perhaps a bridge was being built between two worlds that had once stood apart. One late afternoon, a neighbor named Thomas rode up. He was older, gray-haired, and had once spoken harshly against Ethan for sheltering her. But now his voice was different. "McGraw," Thomas said, dismounting slowly. "Word is, you and that woman of yours stood against raiders. Saved your herd, saved your land. Folks been talking. Not everyone's ready to admit it, but maybe we judged too quickly." Ethan studied him for a long moment before nodding. "She's part of this ranch now. That's not changing. Thomas sighed and looked toward Ahioka, who was kneeling in the garden, her hair catching the sunlight. Seems she's stronger than most give her credit for. Stronger than some of us, even. Ethan felt a quiet pride at his words. Slowly, the walls that once separated them from the community were beginning to crack. As the seasons turned, so too did their lives. Winter came harsh and cold, but together they endured it, keeping the fires burning and the animals safe. Spring followed with new growth in the fields, the garden thriving under Ahioka's care. Ethan saw his ranch transform, not in land or cattle but in spirit. Where once it had been quiet and empty, it was now filled with warmth and life. In time, Ethan realized the words Ahioka had spoken that first night had come true. She had given him a family, not in the way he had first imagined, but in something deeper. Together they created a bond stronger than blood, a family made of trust, sacrifice, and love. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky turn red with sunset, Ethan spoke softly. "When I found you that night, I thought I was saving your life. But maybe, in truth, you saved mine?" Ahioka's eyes shimmered in the fading light. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his. "We saved each other." The ranch around them was quiet but not lonely anymore. The fences stood tall, the garden grew strong, and the animals thrived. More than that, the house and barn were no longer empty shells. They were filled with the presence of two people who had found each other in the harshest of circumstances. The land had tested them, the world had judged them, and raiders had tried to break them. But they had endured it all side by side. And so, under the wide sky of the frontier, Ethan and Ahioka began the next chapter of their lives, not as strangers, not as enemies, but as partners. The promise of family, spoken in desperation that first night, had blossomed into truth. Where once there had been silence, there was now laughter. Where once there had been emptiness, there was belonging. And where once there had been two lonely souls, there was now one family, forged not by chance but by choice.